You know, although Frank Lesser came from a musical family, his father taught piano, for example, he himself was never viewed as the musician. Nobody else in his family thought that he was going to go very far with music. It's kind of a surprise that of the Lessers, he turned out to be the creator, I'm sorry. Anyway, Frank Lesser lived a relatively short life from 1910 to 1969, and he is responsible for Moving from the Bottom Up, a show called How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, a popular operetta called The Most Happy Fella, but probably most importantly, the single most produced musical globally, period. The single most produced musical. The close second to that is a show we'll talk about in another unit called Fiddler on the Roof. Between those two shows, according to their management company, Music Theater International, at any given moment, globally, a production of either Guys and Dolls or Fiddler on the Roof is happening, always. That is how pervasive and how successful these two shows have been. Now, Fiddler on the Roof was written by someone else, Bach and Harnick. We'll talk about them in a different unit. But today I want to talk to you about Guys and Dolls. You know, Frank Lesser taught himself to play piano, although for his whole life, reading and writing music was a big chore. He wanted to be much like his siblings, interestingly, who were offered a chance to do this. Perhaps it was because Lesser had more of an interest in jazz and pop music than he did in classical, and his family was a very strict family, full of people who really cared about classical music. Nonetheless, he tried other jobs before he finally made it as a songwriter. He worked as a legal process server. You know, even in the 50s, if you were being sued, still kind of true, you have to be told directly that you're being sued. And for a while, Frank Lesser's job was to sort of, hide in the bushes and approach someone and go, "Are you Mr. Smith?" And when they said yes, he could hand them the papers and say, now you know you're being sued. That was his job for a while. He was also a restaurant inspector, a jewelry salesman. He finally got work writing songs for, of all people, a group of Rotary clubs in upstate New York. And attendees of the meeting were rather charmed by him, particularly a man who was a publisher who worked in the Rotary Club, a publisher named Leo Feist. Lesser went on to write a number of vaudeville songs and also inspirational songs for the military. He wrote a piece called Praise the Lord and Pass the Ammunition in 1942. He continued to write soldier shows, much like Irving Berlin during the war. After the war, he, like Stein, wrote a great deal of music for Hollywood B Pictures. That's why the two of them wound up working together on I Don't Want to Walk Without You. In fact, in Lesser's case, he wrote a song in 1949 which would win him an Oscar, a song called Baby It's Cold Outside, a kind of holiday duet you may have heard before. This kind of turned Lesser from guy who does the B picture stuff into guy who can write scores and things for Broadway, and a man who was very much in demand. In 1948, he was hired to do a musical version of a play called Charlie's Aunt, called Where's Charlie? Stop if you've heard this plot before, but Charlie really likes this girl, and the girl has a really strict guardian family who want her to only see Charlie when there's a chaperone. And Charlie invents an aunt that can be the chaperone, who is himself, and he comes out in drag, and whenever he wants to talk to the aunt, he's going to have to leave for a minute, the aunt's going to have to come back out. It's that kind of a plot. Real big hit, actually, for Ray Bolger, formerly the Scarecrow from The Wizard of Oz. And a pretty successful little show, a typical, cross-dressing, mistaken identity kind of silliness. But his next musical is a classic through and through. And when I talk about Guys and Dolls from 1950, the book to Guys and Dolls was by a man named Abe Burrows, and it was based on characters who were created by a sports writer named Damon Runyon. In the late 1940s and 1950s, there existed a series of men's magazines specifically aimed at mostly sports, but prose, just articles, the Police Gazette, The Ring, about boxing. Even Sports Illustrated begins as this sort of magazine with less, in fact, the title of Sports Illustrated is because they're one of the ones that have pictures. Other magazines before them aimed at the same audience might not. Because the world of sports was kind of irregular, sometimes there would be a shorter story and less to write about than other times. And as a result, we would be left with something we called marginals, extra short stories that would be written to fill the space so that the page could go to print. Damon Runyon, who was a very successful sports writer in what they call the golden age of sports writing, who wrote beautiful prose about particularly baseball and boxing, would write short stories about sort of characters from the other side of the tracks and kind of ne'er-do-well groups of people, mostly gamblers. And a couple of his short stories got sort of mixed together and written into a column called Runyon Land. And Runyon Land is also the opening number of Guys and Dolls. Guys and Dolls is just full of character parts and silly characters, Harry the Horse and Nicely Johnson and all these sort of characters that people can kind of sink their teeth into and have fun playing these broad comic roles. It is also structured according to the Rodgers and Hammerstein formula. You have an ingenue couple and you have a soubrette couple. In the case of the ingenue couple, you're talking about Sky Masterson and Sarah. The idea being that Sky is a gambler. You may know this already. Sarah works for the Salvation Army in a time when the Salvation Army is less about charity and more about literally saving souls. And they have a lot of prayer meetings. And because he wants to connive to get a chance to be with her, then he offers up all of his friends. He says, I can bring you people to this prayer meeting if you'll go on a date with me. And then he bets his money against having to go to the prayer meeting with his friends. And they wind up in a popular number called Luck Be a Lady, kind of. In the end, Sky wins them, and they all have to trot into the prayer meeting. Prayer meeting gets turned into something a little bit silly and out of control. It turns into a number called Sit Down, You're Rockin' the Boat. And Sarah agrees to go on this date with Sky, which goes pretty well, gets a little bit out of control. On the other side of it, in the soubrette characters, you have Adelaide, and Adelaide is a dancer. I would not call her a stripper by any means, maybe a burlesque character. And Nathan Detroit, her boyfriend, who has been engaged to her for literally years, and Adelaide is upset about that, wants very much for him to pop the question. And their story back and forth about how eventually, after the ups and downs, in a song called Marry the Man Today, the Sarah and Adelaide kind of get together and say, if you marry somebody today, you could maybe change them tomorrow and make them into better people after you marry them, and trick them into settling down. Guys and Dolls is innocent enough, and it is so pervasive, probably because it allows for so many broad types of characters to be played. It was so initially successful in its first run that it's one of the earliest shows to have not one, not two, but three casts in its Broadway initial run who were employed at the same time because they needed to be ready to present many productions and performances of it. Lesser, for his part, was happy with Guys and Dolls, but something perhaps his family were still not happy with him. And that might have fueled the direction he took with the follow-up piece that he did in 1956, a show called The Most Happy Fella. Most Happy Fella takes place in California wine country. You have a guy named Tony, and Tony is the owner of this vineyard. And he's older, he's maybe late 40s, maybe even in his 50s. And he goes on a vacation in San Francisco. If any of you out there from California, you know that you can go on a vacation and still be in the same state because it's so far to travel. He sees a waitress that he really falls in love with because he goes regularly to the same cafe. When he gets back home, he writes her letters, and they write back and forth, and they start to really become attached to each other. She wants a picture of him. He's afraid to send a picture of him as he is, so he sends a photo of another fellow who works in his garden, shirtless, picking grapes and really, muscular and all this and young, and sends her that picture instead, thinking it would never lead to anything. But she comes back to California to surprise him and first meets the guy in the picture before she meets the real Tony. And she and the guy in the picture actually do fall in love, and Tony for some time is really hurt by this, but in the end, after throwing them both off of his farm and saying he didn't want to see any of them ever again, they come back, let him know that they're expecting a baby, and he is moved and changes his mind and decides to give them his blessing, and they live kind of happily ever after. Most Happy Fella has an almost operatic sound to it at times. It is very challenging musically, and some believe that Lesser was writing a piece that was deliberately harder to sing to please the people in his family and some of his friends who felt that what he did with Guys and Dolls was too easy. and was too easy to sing and was not sophisticated enough. In the end, it didn't do as well financially, and you may have only somewhat heard of it. It does get performed from time to time, but it doesn't have the kind of hits that Guys and Dolls had. He returned to comedy in 1961 with a piece called, a very long title, called How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. This piece has been successfully revived on Broadway a few times. Once with Matthew Broderick, once later on with, Harry Potter. I can't think of his name now, but you know. Anyway, those people have both had some successful runs with How to Succeed in Business. It is the story of a young man who works his way up through the Worldwide Widgets Incorporated, which I think is great because it's still WWW. Little did he know that would become such an important anagram. And starts the mailroom. There was a book written by a man named Dale Carnegie called How to Win Friends and Influence People. And it became very popular in its own right. And it was like a whole bunch of aphorisms, just little like, always listen to what people have to say. You know, these like helpful things that. And this play was sort of a satire, sort of a notion of the idea that, if you just followed these simple instructions, there was an answer for every problem that could be found in this book. And in this case, this young man works his way up through the business world. Parts of the show many have suggested are getting a little dated. It has that sort of Mad Men kind of old-time business kind of atmosphere. It has songs like Happy to Keep His Dinner Warm and A Secretary Is Not a Toy and things like that. But the women fare pretty well. There are still some strong women's roles in the show. And it's still pretty popular. It's a show that is frequently done by colleges, high schools, community groups, and churches and things like that. It's a very popular show in that respect. It's also probably notable because it marks one of the early Broadway jobs for a choreographer named Bob Fosse. This is one of Fosse's first shows. It certainly doesn't have the Fosse style, which we'll get into when we talk about Kander and Ebb, but you see a little of it here and there, and it's certainly a well-choreographed piece, and in that respect it becomes an extremely successful venture for Mr. Fosse. Frank Loesser is also probably historically known for being the founder and for a short time the CEO of a company called Music Theater International, or MTI. Frank Loesser, I told you that the Rodgers and Hammerstein Library was influential in the idea of marketing, at first, just Richard Rodgers and Hammerstein shows, and making them accessible to colleges and high schools and such to do. Loesser saw that model and realized that he could, among other things, encourage up-and-coming composers, advance shows that had been seen on Broadway. In other words, Loesser himself did not have a catalog nearly as broad as Richard Rodgers's, but Loesser was willing to form a company in which he said, my company, either starting with his own shows as a bedrock, they're always available through MTI, of course, and then other composers that he would find interesting, he would say, I can help you. Let me carry your show. Let me offer it in my catalog of shows. You can order an MTI catalog. In fact, if you go to mtishows.com, you can look at this yourself. And for folks like me who are doing a job where you might be directing a show, you can leaf through pages of plot synopses and cast lists and ideas. These are shows that these people have gone to and read through and prepared a script for and a score. You pay them, and they pay a portion of what you pay them to the author or the author's estate. You sign contracts that they monitor, that make sure you don't change the ending or do something dramatic with the piece itself. And they provide you with the sheet music and all of the materials that you need to put the show on. MTI is the leading company now in this field, although there are several other rivals. The real big three in this, the Rodgers and Hammerstein Library, who now carry their stuff and a few other people's stuff. Tams and Whitmark, who are the last surviving company of Tin Pan Alley, grew out of that. And MTI, which was founded by Mr. Loesser. In fact, on the cover of MTI, you will see a conductor drawn by Al Hirschfeld, the famous caricaturist of theater, and sort of with a baton. In fact, the baton in his left hand, and Loesser was left-handed. It's a drawing of Frank Loesser, and it's probably become it's sort of their logo. Unfortunately, Loesser was a very heavy chain smoker. He was one of those people who would finish a cigarette and start a new one, and there are very few photographs of Frank Loesser without an ashtray. on the piano. In fact, the MTI catalog had to use digital means to get all of the cigarettes out of the pictures with Frank Loesser. And what do you know, he died of lung cancer in 1969 at a very young age, just 59 years old, and did not get to finish too many more musicals after How to Succeed, although he did work on some other songs. MTI is really his other big gift, his big legacy, is the fact that through his company, not only can you now rent a reliable, accurate source for his material, but that of many, many other shows as well, including some of the most recent Tony Award-winning shows from the last few years. Well, one of the things that I mentioned was that Loesser wanted to support other new composers and discover writers. And in one case, he made the discovery of a songwriting team, a team of Richard Adler and Jerry Ross. They became protégés of Frank Loesser, and he helped them with the beginnings of their career. And many say he may have ghostwritten a few of the songs that are in some of their shows, because their shows, in some respects, sound a little like something that Frank Loesser would have written. Adler and Ross are part of our next module. We'll talk about them and their career, as well as Jerry Bach and a few other details. So join us for that, and thanks so much again.